this is one of the most beautiful paintings I've ever seen. To me, it's just like, this is Australia. It's the sunshine, the land, the power of the land. And this is by the Spinifex people. Now, the Spinifex people are extraordinary. And I'm going to just tell you a story, and it's very, very important to Spinifex people today. So it starts 7,000 years ago. And 7,000 years ago, the continent of Australia was disappearing at an alarming rate due to climate change. For the previous 8,000 years, the ice had been melting and the sea was encroaching. And by 7,000 years ago, a third of the continent of Australia had disappeared. And so the Spinifex hunting grounds were being lost, sacred sites were being lost, and people didn't know when it was going to end. And so the Spinifex people, they're Jacopa people, the Tingara people, they are called the people of the sun and the people of the shadow. And in all the Aboriginal communities I've ever visited, I have never felt such a profound correctness in their Tingari, because they would sit under trees, and on the ground, the shadows of the trees, reflected, made by the sun, would create these beautiful, beautiful paintings. Anyway, back to 7,000 years ago. So, very alarmed at the loss of their sacred grounds, the Tingari spirit people, the Spinifex spirit people, went and they marched across southwards, across the Nullarbor plain. And they had spears, they all held spears. And the people of the sun stood on the cliffs above the encroaching sea. And they built a palisade so that the waters would no longer encroach. And the people of the shadow went into the valleys and gorges and again built these palisades so that the water could not approach. So the Spinifex people believed they saved that part of Australia and held the melting ice cap of the last ice age, which was between 15 and 6,000 years ago, and that their spirit ancestors stopped it. So they very firmly believe that they have a strong claim to this land. Now, the land where they come from, the artists of this painting, is called the Nullarbor Plain. And I don't know if any of you ever studied Latin. What do you think Nullarbor means?
It means no trees.
Good, yes. Oh, well, you're Australian, you know that. So anyway, Nullarbor Plain means no trees. And when white people came to Australia, it was just this vast tract of red uninhabited desert, supposedly with no trees. Actually, when I went to visit the Spinifex people, I have never seen a more beautiful landscape. It was like a stately park in England, beautiful trees and manicured grasslands because they look after the land. Anyway, at that time, they had, so after this episode with the holding back the water, 200 generations of Spinifex people lived happily on this land, which their law, their spirits and their ceremonies had put a stamp on as their land, and nobody bothered them. Until about 1950s, when the British government decided it wanted to carry out some atomic explosions, and it thought, where in our realm is somewhere that it doesn't really matter if we let off atomic bombs? And they thought Australia, and then where in Australia? Well, the Nullarbor Plain, it's so empty and there's nobody there, it's uninhabited. And so they started building, they spoke to the Australian government and the Prime Minister Robert Menzies said, yep, go for it, guys. And so they built these railway tracks, and the artist, one of the artists that painted this picture, saw these steel tracks being laid through the desert. And he thought it was the sign of the water snake, serpent. His tracks were coming, and he was terrified. And then they started seeing planes flying over them, and they would hide and throw magic objects at the planes to try and knock them out of the sky. So suddenly the world was coming towards them. But the Europeans didn't know the Spinifex people had been living there and had saved the continent of Australia. And so it wasn't until just before the first atomic bomb was being let off that somebody saw a Spinifex person, and they went, "What are you doing here?" And they said, "Well, this is our country. We live here. This is our country." And it's bigger than England, remember that. And so they went, "Oh, the government, well, we spent so much money on this atomic bomb, we have to let it off." So they said, "Listen, run along these tracks, but don't go off the tracks and do not drink any water because you will die, because the water is going to be poisoned. There's going to be a walpa wea, a big wind, and you must get far, far away." So everyone, gathered what they had, their family, and they started running along this road built by the atomic weapons station. And many of the people, the Spinifex people that came and stayed with me in London, and who painted this picture, their mothers, fathers, brothers, sisters, uncles, aunts, many of their relatives dropped dead by the road because they were too frightened to drink the water, or they drank the water from the poisoned water holes. And eventually they got to Kundalini Mission, and they had to stay there until the late 70s, early 80s, when the government thought that the desert had cleared itself up and that it would be safe for people to go back there. And then an amazing thing happened. In 1992, an Aboriginal from the Torres Strait called Eddie Mabo took the Australian government to court and said, "You must acknowledge that we own this land." And another thing that I'm not sure if any of you know is that when Australia was first discovered, it was declared terra nullius by the House of Parliament here, and the criteria for declaring a land terra nullius, uninhabited land, was that the indigenous people had no system of agriculture, and one of the things we have just learnt in the last 30 years is that the indigenous people of Australia had the most sophisticated system of agriculture. I cannot even begin, that's a whole other discussion. It's so brilliant and so sophisticated how they knew how to live on this extraordinary land and to love it and to nurture it. And in fact, these paintings actually are examples of that nurturing. Anyway, because of the Mabo decision, the High Court of Australia actually acknowledged native title, as it was called. And that opened the doors for Aboriginal people in all these different countries that I've shown you to stake a claim with the Commonwealth Government and say, "Please, can we have our land back?" So the Spinifex people went to, they invited the Premier of Western Australia out to their most sacred site, one of these extraordinary waterholes. And the Premier, Mr. Court, signed an agreement. It took 3 days only for the big mining companies to relinquish their claim to Spinifex country and for the government, the Native Title Tribunal, to award the Spinifex people this vast tract of country. And the story I told you about the people of the shadow and the people of the sun is actually relevant to that legal decision. So these aren't just stories of some vague creation. They've actually got the power of legal documents, or have had the force of legal documents. And so, with typical Aboriginal generosity, the Spinifex people painted 10 paintings of their creation stories, of the Sun people and people of Shadow, and they donated them to the people of Western Australia. And that was a lovely gift, but it also put a burden on the recipient to acknowledge their ownership of the land and their legal title to it. And those paintings today are displayed in the National Gallery of Western Australia.